Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome to the third lecture, yet another one of logistics management, and I am your host, Dr. Khurram Shahzad Mughal. I guess in the last two lectures we have been discussing the importance of supply chain management and logistics management, and in that we emphasized that it is the most important, one of the most important aspects of success of any business or maybe like profitability of any business. Now in the last lecture specifically we differentiated between logistics management and supply chain management, and we discussed that logistics management is part of supply chain management, is a part of a process, as a part of the whole supply chain process, in which it is concerned with the delivery of product from the raw material to the end user, and as well as the flow of information in both directions. And then we came to the definition of supply chain process and the supply chain management, which concerns with all the activities involved in the whole process of delivery of raw material, from the delivery of raw material to the production to the product to the end user, as well as the flow of information in all the directions, in both directions, as well as the management of those relationships between the vendors and the customers, and the customers and suppliers basically, and the central firm. So we basically concluded somehow that actually, since the mission of both of these two is the same, it is a provision of the goods and services to the customers, to add value to the goods and services, to provide them that good and service on the time it is needed, at the location it is needed, at the cost or price at which they would be willing to pay that price in a certain specific environment, as well as you can say by minimizing the whole cost of this process, and in other words enhancing the profitability of the firm. So we concluded that we would use logistics management and supply chain management, or logistics process and supply chain process, synonymously. Both of these two actually add value to and ensure profitability of the firm. Now based on this we came to this diagram, the whole schematic representation of the supply chain process. Now why I brought this up again is that I need to discuss this goes on in continuity from the first lecture to, from the second lecture to the third lecture, and this would be this is like a continual discussion from the second lecture. The supply chain as a whole in this diagram, I would just quickly go through it once so that you can remember what we discussed exactly. The supply chain as a whole, and in the global environment there are two broader types of interactions that takes place which are necessary. One are the interactions of separate business entities, like for example the customer and the producer itself. For example, firm A, we are talking about firm A, then that firm's relationships with the customer, that firm's relationships with the supplier, and that firm's management of its relationship with the suppliers and customers, and so the process goes on. That thing, the focal firm, is represented in the last line of this diagram. Focal firm, customer's customer, on the left side it is supplier, and the supplier's supplier. So based on these management of relationships, because supply chain process is dependent on how these relationships are managed, inter-corporate relationships are managed. So that inter-corporate coordination is on the third panel of this diagram, that is functional shifting, the third party providers, relationship management, and the whole supply chain structure. So this is to be managed in terms of the focal firm, and these relationships and all these coordinations are to be handled as a single process. This is what the main focus is about, because we cannot, it is not easy to treat them as individual processes and then consider all of these as you can say all of these as to be successful, to be efficient, to be effective. You need to have a holistic view of it. So in this matter, in this aspect, that coordination and their relationships are to be managed for the firm to be successful. And in the end, on the right side of this schematic diagram, you would see that the main aim of whole this process is customer satisfaction, value addition to the customer, profitability, and competitive advantage. that competitive advantage with other firms can only be gained once you are providing that service, that product at the time when it is needed, at the location where it is needed, and at the price or the cost in which the customer is willing to pay, and that cost is lesser, the total cost of that process is less than the price itself. Only then they can earn profit. So the main aim, the main target is that competitive advantage and customer value addition, because once there is customer value addition, there is customer satisfaction, the profitability and competitive edge would come automatically. So then we also discussed that in the lower panel below intercorporate coordination, there are interfunctional coordination, that is the coordination between various departments of a firm, like for example marketing, sales, R&D, logistics, production, purchasing, information systems, finance and customer services, and I guess human resource also. The aim of this is that you cannot only rely on one single department to achieve its target, to achieve its goal, without making sure that other departments are working in coordination for achievement of the organizational goal. So the departmental goals should be in line with the organizational goal, and that alignment can be achieved by having a coordinated activity, or treating it as a coordinated process rather than an individual process. So based on this, these interdepartmental relationships, interfunctional relationship, interfunctional coordination is dependent on the trust, the commitment, the risk and dependence and behavior of each and every department. No doubt that it is a possibility that interorganizational politics might become a hurdle in this whole coordination process, but that has to be managed. I also discussed, we would come to that as well later on, that the whole organizational process, are in certain cases there are overlapping areas between various departments, in which for example sales and marketing are overlapping with each other in certain areas, logistics and marketing would be overlapping in certain areas, production and logistics would be overlapping in certain areas. Those certain functions would be responsibility of both of these departments. And secondly, if we have a bigger picture, from the supply of the raw material to actual delivery of the product, the main aim is customer value addition, and in the light of that aim, in the light of that aim, it is important to see that marketing would be those people who would be working on certain number of P's, price, promotion, product and place, and those things, and they would generate demand for the product, but they would also generate the forecast and actually let you know how much quantity is required, and that quantity required is to be produced by the production facility. For that production facility, for production of that product, financial resources would be required, finance comes in, and that flow of information is to be managed by the information management systems department, or having an information management system. And the link between all these relationships with, for example, the production would need to have relationships with, for example, the suppliers of the raw material, or the suppliers, so that the product and the raw material is available at the time when it is required to be used. Based on that, you would see that logistics also, or this whole supply chain process has to be seen as a bigger process, not as smaller individual processes, and that flow of information and the flow of product can only be ensured to be done in a cost effective and efficient manner if the coordination is smooth between these departments. So with this, after this schematic diagram that I just repeated, let's move on. You would see that supply chain, the whole process, there are many recurring activities, right? For example, let us consider the logistics aspect of the delivery aspect of the whole supply chain process. There would be so many times that forecast would be forwarded by the marketing department and the product would be delivered. Now that loading, unloading process might take place at several steps. The inventory management might take place at several steps. Once the product is delivered to customer, the product might be defective and it needs to come back to the production facility. So there are so many things that are recurring, and each process is repeated many times, so that in the end the supply of your product is ensured to the customer. I hope you would know that why it is so important for the product to be at the shelf when the customer goes there to buy the product. I explained that in the last lecture very clearly. It is important because once the customer goes to that shelf to buy that product, if the product is not over there, they would look for the substitutes. When they look for substitutes, they might become loyal customers of those that other product. But still the point is that to ensure that that product is over there on time, at the location where it is needed and in that given environment, and at that in the low cost manner it is delivered over there, to ensure that many processes are repeated. These processes are full of recurring activities that are done again and again. And the second important aspect of supply chain is usually no single source point is located in one place. You see, your raw material may be dispersed. Now first let's look at it at in national level. For example, let's talk about Nestle. To be more specific, let's talk about Nestle Milk Pack. Its source of the main material, for example milk that is processed and sold, is not located in one location. It might have several facilities where Nestle Milk Pack would collect that milk to be delivered to the factory for processing. So that would mean it is not located in one place, it would be scattered. And secondly, the plants, in certain cases, plants also might be scattered. And then to meet customers' needs in different areas, in different regions, warehouses might be scattered from which supplies are provided. There are different mechanisms to decide those locations. One of them, for example, we discussed earlier that there is weight gaining and weight losing production process, and another one is about when we are talking about specifically about the warehouse, from which is the center from where deliveries to different regions are ensured. For example, one might be in Punjab, one might be in certain area of KPK or Sindh or Balochistan. Now you cannot make one warehouse and ensure delivery from that. You need to have multiple warehouses, and then to decide the locations of those warehouses, there are certain often very statistical techniques as well. One of them is gravity model, where you consider warehouse as a center of gravity, and you center of gravity, and then you see that deliveries are provided from that hub to different areas. So even those hubs might be scattered since your customers are scattered. So there is usually no single source point. And when we talk about that aspect at the time of globalization, with you can say with larger number of countries involved in trade with each other these days, with easier tariff agreements in terms of WTO and all that, with more political relationships strengthening across the globe, one of the major aspects is increasing trade and increasing foreign direct investment and other types of mechanisms in which firms either take over the firm in another country or actually install a production facility over there. So these different types of investments result into you can say more burden or more responsibility on the supply chain professionals. Now if one single facility of production is located in, when you pick up a mobile phone, right, there are so many parts inside a mobile phone. Once you open it, take out the battery, you would see that battery would be coming from someplace else, and if you open it, I'm sure you won't be able to close it after you open it, but because it would be damaged by then. But the point is that once you open it, you would see that different chips and different parts are from different regions. When they are from different regions, so they need to be over there at the time of assembly of those parts. Now, if they need to be over there at the time of assembly of those parts, one rest assured that most of them do not originate from a single source. They are coming from different points. So when they are coming from different points, that process needs to be managed that they are available at the time of assembly. So the job of supply chain professional becomes more complicated. If you drive a car or a bike, you would see that different parts are from the different areas. Some would be from, for example, made in Pakistan, some would be made in China, some would be from Malaysia or Thailand or Taiwan or wherever, or Japan or even Korea. So when they are assembled together, even if a plant is installed in one central location in some certain country, most of the production facilities are shifting to, for example, Bangladesh and China and India because of excessive labor availability, better trade environment, better production environment, better manufacturing environment, or rather better business environment. So and their cost of production is lower. The government provides facilities for producing and exporting, and then they have export relationships and export channels already established with many more countries. So many production facilities are being located over there in these countries. Once these facilities are located in these countries, that would mean that that would simply mean that various parts are being delivered from different regions to those facilities for production. And since these there is no single source point, that would mean that supply chain process would need to be more active and would need to be more efficient and effective to ensure that the product is over there on time. Now, control of firm over its raw material source and the point of consumption for customers is very different. When we talk about the supply chain process, if we are talking about firm A, then we saw in the last schematic diagram that there is the focal firm, then there is its customer, there is its supplier, and then its customers and supplier. You see, so Pepsi company does not deliver you its bottles directly at your doorstep. You cannot go to, you do not in fact go to the Pepsi company factory and buy the product. It goes through a whole longer process to be delivered to you. You go to a shop, you pay some amount of rupees, 45-50 rupees, and you get that Coke bottle. That Coke bottle is delivered to that you can say shopkeeper through a central distributor, maybe privately owned, not belonging to the Pepsi or Coke company. That distributor actually gets it from the warehouse. There might be some other distributor involved within that. That warehouse gets it from the factory, and same goes for the raw material. The original originator of the raw material is providing raw material to someone. That someone is might be providing to someone else, and that someone else might be providing to the factory where it is being produced. So the point is that the firm does not have that much control over the source of the raw material, or actually the person or the entity who is extracting or providing the raw material, because there are so many intermediaries involved, and same goes from the customer side. Once this happens, that loss of control over your point of connection, your point of delivery, and your loss of control over the point of supply makes the supply chain process very difficult. And in the last lecture, we specifically emphasized a lot on relationships, managing the relationships, because supply chain process is also about managing the relationships. Because your supplier would be able to supply you well in time if its supplier is providing that raw material to it well in time. So the whole supply chain process is dependent on many different entities, and then there are so many other issues involved. Like for example, specifically in case of Pakistan, there are sometimes strikes by, for example, carriage companies. There are strikes by, for example, there are traffic blockages. There are, for example, you can say fuel shortages. So in that case, the supply chain process even becomes more difficult. Once the product is not over there, I repeat, once the product is not there on the shelf, that non-availability pushes the customers to ensure, you can say, to substitute that product. And it is a fact of life. Yesterday I went to buy something, I could not find it on the shelf. The usual product that I use, I bought something else. Because it is not so rigid in certain cases. There might be certain types of products that you would not switch in any case, but that is a little rather rare, But still, so with that loss of control, the importance of supply chain process or relationships in your logistics management process becomes very important, and it becomes the central area of your focus, other than the interdepartmental coordination, because that interdepartmental coordination is completely under your control. But you can, if you have a broader view of that, those are your departments, those are firm's department, it has a stronger control over those departments. But when it comes to the relationships with other firms, that is totally a different story. Then if we segregate into two halves, control of firm over its source of raw material and the control of firm over its point of customer contact or point of consumption for the customer, there are basically, you can look at them as physical supply channel and physical distribution channel. Physical supply channel is the logistic part, is the part of those logistics in which raw material is being provided to the firm for the production. And physical distribution channel is when the product has been produced, you can distribute that product is at you can say to the customer. These are two different channels. These can be treated as two different channels. In fact, we would look at this again. It was treated as two different separate processes. I said that you had two options. You can look at different processes individually, or you can look at it as a broader coordinated activity. In order to those activities to be coordinated, those processes to be coordinated with each other, nowadays it is treated necessary that you have a broader look over them. You should treat them as those activities which are strongly interlinked with each other as a one single big process. Now, in previous times, in the aspect of logistics management, these two might be categorized and treated separately. We would come to that again once more when we will look at the evolution of logistics management. Now, further, there is another important aspect that I discussed yesterday, the reverse logistics channel. The reverse logistics channel can be considered in terms of information, in which the information flows back, but more specifically it is looked at when, for example, when you supply a product, when you're supplying a product, you need to make sure that you have reverse logistics channel for the defective products that might come for repair, that might come from for the purpose of you can say either repair or when they are obsolete and they are being disposed of. So in both cases there would be a reverse logistics channel. For example, in Germany, I read it someplace that in Germany it is necessary in certain areas, I guess, that when the distribution point, actually the seller, the retailer, has to ensure that the cereal boxes that are being delivered to them, or in certain types of boxes, are to be returned. They are not to be taken away by the customers, returned for disposal actually. And so in order to reduce waste, in terms of these are like sort of environmental friendly laws. So that is like a reverse logistics channel. And similarly, if you, for example, buy a product and you buy a television maybe with a warranty, and it starts malfunctioning within that warranty, you take it to the service point, customer service point. That service point claims the warranty. Either they pay you back the money, or they, for example, give you another alternate product, a similar product. Okay, this is damaged, that's our responsibility, you get this new one. So now that product, defective product that has been returned, it needs to go back to the vendor. It needs to go back to, for example, the original producer, the production manufacturing facility. Why? Or the firm itself. So that distributor, now that product would be returned to the distributor, right? When it is returned to the distributor, that distributor would pay you money against that, or give you another product. Now that defective product has to be claimed from the firm, so it would go back, and that firm would pay him the money. and that defective product would go to, for example, for repairs or for disposal. If it is disposed of, that's totally a different story. But if it is repaired and sold in a secondary market, that is like another supply chain aspect, another branch of logistics. But the point is that process of the product going back is termed in reverse logistics. Now, this is the immediate supply chain for an individual firm. Like there is like vendor, plants and ports, which is the source. From that it is being transported. We have seen this before, but since now we have discussed that, I just showed it to you before in terms of a broader view, so that you can have an image of what is logistics management, what we are discussing right now. But now I'm turning out it, making it to be specific. Now we have discussed the supply chain, we have discussed the logistics management. Now with that discussion, now let's look at this whole schematic diagram, or this graphical this image. We can identify different aspects that we have discussed up till now. There is a vendor who supplies the raw material. That raw material is transported to a warehouse, a central location where all the raw material is being stored. That can be for two reasons. One might be that warehousing facility is accumulating raw material from different sources. There might not be one single plant and one single port, as we said earlier, that there might be multiple locations, multiple source points. And secondly, it needs to store so that whenever the factory needs for its production, the material is over there. It never goes short. It might not be a huge storage facility, because it would be, you can say, topped up whenever certain amount goes down. There might be some alarming levels of raw material, but then the point is that factory needs to have it when it is producing. Then from that warehouse, it is the raw material, the intermediate product or the raw material is transported to the factory through another logistics process. That after producing the product, that product goes to another warehousing or storage facility. From that storage facility, as I discussed, that we have gravity models for that to define various you can say hubs in different country or across the globe from where the product is supplied to different regions. This might be one of them. There might be multiple of these warehouses for one single factory. There might be multiple factories for producing a product. From there it is transported to the customer. And if at that point there is an issue with that product, there is a warranty claim, that would come back in the same supply chain process. That would be reverse logistics. And then additionally, you would see that in terms of information flows, that line has arrows on both sides. That means that information flow will be in both directions. We discussed that in terms of the definitions of logistics management, as well as in the definition of supply chain management. So this whole supply chain, which can be when discussed in terms of flow of information, while coming back, it might be information regarding future demands, it can be information regarding future expectations, it can be future demand would mean forecast of the product's demand, what quantity is to be supplied, what quantity is required. It can be about new ideas, how the product should be like, what the customer demands now, what are his expectations from the product. It can be this information about can also be about various defects in the product. For example, in a certain car manufacturer, actually when they produced a car, they had a customer sales representative who just observed the market in their car showrooms, and they found out that women with longer nails had difficulty in opening the doors. It had certain specifications, a certain type of a door in which they had difficulty, and that would scratch the paint. Now that is a very specific, a very different type of information. That information is to be transported back through that supply chain process to maybe the department of R&D or maybe to the production facility for changing that specification so that that problem never comes up again. Another important incident that took place, that one of the car manufacturers had faulty brakes and all the cars were distributed. And when all those cars were distributed to different countries, when they found out that there was a fault with its brakes, basically, you must have heard of it. And I don't want to name the company or anything, but what they did was that they recovered all those thousands of cars from across the globe, except Pakistan, across the globe. Now, that automatically meant the reverse logistics. The car was delivered, it was pulled back. And you must have heard number of incidents in developed countries when the product is distributed, then it is reverted due to some defect in that product. In order to improve the quality of the product, it might be a consumption product, it might be a luxury good, it might be any other physical product. So the point is that what I'm highlighting over here is that with that flow of information backwards, there is some defect, the information comes back, the management takes a decision, they ask for the product to be retrieved from the market, and that product is retrieved. That is a reverse supply chain process, reverse logistics. And same goes for information going forward also, about different changes and improvements in the products as well. So this whole image might be a single firm's you can say supply chain, but what is not obvious in it is the customer's customer and the supplier's supplier. This might be a longer supply chain process. This might be not this simplified. As I said, that this diagram represents a very simplified process in which, if we assume that a firm, we were discussing that firm usually does not have control over its actual point of raw material, source of raw material, and its point where the customer is receiving the product. So this might be the case as well. So in that case, this is a basic supply chain diagram of a single firm, but then there would be other entities involved in this, and this would be a network sort of thing where different points are connected with transportation facilities, where raw material is provided to different warehouses, where different warehouses forward the raw material to maybe one single factory or factory in different locations, and those factories transport after making the finished product to various warehouses, and those various warehouses distribute the product to different source points where the customers would be able to get the product. One important thing that we can see over here is that it is not that the product is made and just delivered to you. A whole big process and chain is involved in that, and that chain has to be managed as one larger activity rather than managing it individually, because that is important for the customer to have that product when they need it and the location they need it. Now, while moving on, I discussed a few minutes back the physical distribution channel and the physical supply channel, and I said that we would discuss that when we move towards evolution of supply chain management. I also mentioned a number of times before that you can look at all the activities or the business process, the whole business process, into smaller segmented processes, and you can have a bird's eye view of it. You can manage it as one single activity, a coordinated activity, a coordinated process made up of very smaller processes or multiple smaller processes. So up till the point of 1960s, all the activities were treated as fragmented. All different activities like demand forecasting, purchasing, requirements planning, production planning, manufacturing, inventory, warehousing, materials handling, packaging, finished goods inventory, distribution processing, planning, order processing, transportation, customer services, strategic planning, information services, marketing, sales, and finance. With the evolution of supply chain management, with the evolution of logistics management, up till the point when you see it 2000 onwards, they all combine to become under one single big large umbrella. If you look at them further, from 1960 to 2000, between those two eras or decades, between those 4 decades approximately, as I said, that there is physical distribution channel and physical supply channel. That physical distribution channel is mentioned as physical supply channel is mentioned as purchasing and materials management, and the physical distribution channel is mentioned as physical distribution channel. Now, if you look at all these activities, these all fragmented activities either come under physical supply channel or come under physical distribution channel or become a mix of these two. Like for example, the first five in fact, demand forecasting is the responsibility of physical supply channel, purchasing is the responsibility of physical supply channel, requirements planning, production planning and manufacturing inventory are part of physical supply channel, in which the raw material is the demand for raw material is being forecasted, in which the actual purchase is being made, in which the total requirements for the future, and again based on that how much raw material is required is being planned, the production is being planned, and the inventory for that production process is being maintained and planned. Based on that, all these five activities sum up to be physical supply channel. Now, other than that, there are certain specific activities which are associated to physical distribution channel. I'm not talking about the activities that go in both of them. Let's leave them. The next three activities, warehousing, materials handling and packaging, are those activities which are directly associated to physical supply channel and physical distribution channel, right? These lines that are mentioned against each activity represents in which broader area they are part of. Now, warehousing, materials handling and packaging are actually the part of physical supply channel and physical distribution channel also as well, because you need to maintain, in the last diagram we saw that there is a warehouse for raw material also and there are warehouses for finished products also. So warehousing is part of both of them. Material handling is again part of both of them, because the raw material is required to be handled. There are different specifications of raw materials. There might be liquids, there might be solids, there might be certain items which can be stored under any type of environment. There are certain items which are to be stored in a specific environment. It can be, for example, a perishable item like fish or vegetables or fruits, and it might be a product that is chemically, you can say, unstable. For example, certain chemicals used in medicines or certain chemicals used in for example batteries or cells. There might be certain type of physical product which might get rust, for example iron or other types of metal which get corroded once laid in humid environment, for example. So materials handling, and same goes for the product also. Once you produce yogurt, it needs to be stored in a colder environment. You produce milk, it has its expiry date on it. You produce tomato ketchup, it has expiry date, but it is like a little bit longer than yogurt or milk. You might be producing cells, you might be batteries, for example. You might be producing mobile phones, you might be producing cars, for example. So whatever you are producing, all the materials are required to be handled in a certain specific way. There are specifications in which how that product is to be handled and stored in which environment, what type of environment. Certain might be needing a room temperature. You have often seen an inscription on the medicines that some medicines are to be refrigerated and in a dry, cold environment. Some medicines might need to be stored in for example, room temperature. Like that. So products are also required to be handled in their specific environment. So that is why materials handling goes to physical supply channel as well as physical distribution channel. Then about packaging, because the products are to be packaged and the raw material is also to be packaged. Again, the same thing. Packaging would mean how they are stored, in what containers or what types of boxes they are stored. There might be, if you see, for example, those milk cartons or juice cartons, for example, they are in certain specific carton in which it has a specific thickness with multiple layers inside it to protect the product inside it. Same goes for example, the vegetable oils that are maybe in tins, in which the inner lining is of very reflective nature, because so that the liquid does not react with the metal itself. So, and same goes for the raw material. Certain chemicals might be stored in plastic containers, certain chemicals might be stored into, for example, in metal containers. Certain type of acids would react to plastic but would not react to metal. Certain type of chemicals would react to plastic and not react to metal, and certain types of chemicals would react to metal and not to plastic. And then there are, for example, metals that might erode if not stored properly. So this packaging in which the product and the raw material is sold, in which the supplying firm supplies you, our focus firm, with the raw material, because you are their customer now. So that product is supplied in a specific packaging, right? So that is why that packaging is part of physical distribution channel as well as physical supply channel. Then physical supply channel is above the physical distribution channel. So then again, physical distribution channels also includes, other than these three which are part of both of them, it also includes finished goods inventory. Once the goods are being produced, they are stored, of course. Then again, in terms of material handling, which is already a part of it, I already discussed that in certain environment. Certain firms might keep larger inventories depending on the demand of the product. Certain firms might keep minimal inventories. Then again, depending on the expiry date on that product, certain firms cannot keep larger inventories. For example, a yogurt has an expiry date, I guess 2 weeks, 3 weeks from the date of manufacturing. There is always manufacturing date and the use date. Certain medicines have very specific expiry dates on them. So, and certain things have longer expiry dates, and then there are certain things which do not have an expiry date at all. It depends on the use of those goods. For example, a mouse or a keyboard might never get damaged for a very, very, very long time. It is very difficult to predict their expiry date. It depends on the usability. But once you open a medicine, the counter starts ticking for those medicines. There are two types, for example, one that would expire in a certain date, and one that can be used in a specific time period once it is opened. In very often on juice cartons, it is written that after opening you can use it within 4 days, right? People use it for more than that, but they would recommend for 4 days or a week. And then it is, once opened, it can only be stored in a colder environment, in a refrigerator, for example. So another very interesting aspects of different products written based on instructions written on them. So the finished goods inventory has to be in line with the type of the product. Certain products can, and for example, certain products which are not perishable that easily, for example, mobile phones. But what is the problem with the mobile phone? Can anybody tell me? Why can't you produce lots of them and store them? I guess one of you got that right, or few of you got right. The point is that there are technological advancements. The technology changes. That model would become obsolete once the next model comes up. For example, if you had keypad phones a long time ago, I don't know you kids have seen the keypad phones in your whole life or not, but many of them are gone now, because we started with Nokia 3310. That was an interesting set. We called it 3310, an interesting name. So that 3310 was actually the one which was the toughest phone around. So, but then it got obsolete. With touch technology, with colored screens and all that, it got obsolete. So what if Nokia had produced millions and gazillions of them and stored them? They would have, that inventory would have been useless. So how much inventory to maintain depends on multiple aspects. And those multiple aspects are also listed somehow in this list, right? Because when you talk about, for example, materials handling and packaging and requirements and demand forecasting, all these aspects somehow define how much inventory is to be maintained, because all these activities are interlinked. And once all these activities are interlinked, that is why they become subset of, for example, physical supply channel and physical distribution channel. And that is why I was focusing that you need to have strong interdepartmental communication, interfunctional communication, marketing, sales, R&D, manufacturing, production, finance, and all those are to be interlinked very strongly with each other, with efficient flow of information. Then there is distribution planning, because how to distribute, where to distribute it, in what quantities to be distributed, what mechanism of distribution would be used. For example, in terms of physical distribution, would it be delivery in terms of you can say in road transportation or air transportation, or for example through you can say through ships, through ocean or sea, and what mode of depending on what mode of transportation is being used, you have to define the distribution also, and you have to plan the distribution also. What quantities can be sent in a least cost manner, and how to reach all those different regions, and what customers to engage, so that you can ensure that the product is delivered to the end customer at the right time, at the right cost, and at the right location. The transportation is also a part of physical distribution channel, and would also be somehow a part of physical supply channel, but it has not been, because that would be the responsibility of your supplier, not you maybe. That is why it is not mentioned here. Then there is order processing. Order processing is that sometimes the firms would we will discuss that again later. Order processing, whenever an order for a certain batch or a product is received, then it is to be processed. That processing involves obviously multiple steps. We will discuss those steps later. And for that order processing, you need to have raw material with you, and that is responsibility of physical distribution supply channel. But in terms of physical distribution channel, when you have the order, there is certain amount of time it is prepared, and then the distribution, the delivery of that order in the specified time period is also the responsibility of obviously supply chain management, and responsibility of physical distribution channel. Because nowadays it has become, because we would look at it at a broader view, we would look at it as one single broad activity, because now we are in 2000s plus, we would call it the supply chain management. But once an order is placed on Amazon or any online site, they give you a specific amount of time, that this is the time the product would be delivered. That is the responsibility of, that would have been the responsibility of physical distribution channel only in those times, from 1960 to 2000 approximately. These are approximate dates, so don't be that specific. Now, so that order once received is to be processed along with the payment, along with the placement of order to the manufacturing, and with the placement of that order to the manufacturing, the product is produced, the product is delivered to logistics for transportation, and then it is transported. Then it is delivered to the customer on the before or on the committed time. So that would be part of physical distribution channel. And as I already discussed, transportation is another important part of physical distribution channel, because when you transport a good, you have multiple ways to transport it. You have, for example, air shipments, you have, for example, road transportation, you have shipment through, for example, ships, and through that sea shipments. Now, the point is that different transportations have their costs and benefits. Air transportation is the quickest one if you are talking globally, right? And that, if it is the quickest one, but it would be an expensive one, and a certain quantity can be transferred, not more than that. In case of sea shipments, those shipments might be cheaper, but they would take a longer time. And once they would take a longer time, but still you can transport a huge quantity of it. But then another aspect of it is that firm might not be producing only one product, right? That is sort of an area of freight coordination. That is again the responsibility of the logistician or the supply chain management professional. All those shipments and all those deliveries to certain areas can be coordinated, and further they can further be coordinated with your physical supply channel. For example, we bring raw material from, let's call it from a certain country, for example, you can say from Europe, for example. We produce something. When we need the raw material from Europe, we don't do that. But what's wrong with taking an example? Now, we get that raw material from there, and we produce the product, and then we deliver that product back to raw material through shipments, through sea shipments. Now, why once the container is being hired or being delivering the product, let's hire that container to bring back the raw material, or maybe if there is sufficient space on it, we can send multiple products to Europe and we can bring some multiple amounts of raw material from there. It depends on the quantity that is being delivered. So that freight coordination reduces costs also. So then that is why it is the responsibility of physical distribution channel. It can come under both. Then there are customer services, the responsibility of physical distribution channel, because the customer services points are established in various regions, and those regions it is associated to reverse flow of the flow of information as well as the reverse logistics process. When a product is faulty and you need to provide customer services at the point, for example, if your landline goes out of order, you call PTCL, and the serviceman comes over there and sees that what is if something is wrong physically, then they would need to check that product themselves, and they need to provide you customer support. Now that customer support serviceman would or representative would look at the product, and again that is the responsibility of physical distribution channel. And in case the product is faulty and it is required to be replaced, it would go through reverse logistics, and then the new product or the replacement would be delivered to you. Now that is why customer services is part of physical distribution channel, because physical distribution channel comes in contact with the customer services. Then these two link up to become logistics. When looked at them individually, physical supply channel and physical distribution channel, in those times period, they would be termed as logistics. But when you talk about logistics management and supply chain management, all these plus, for example, 4 more aspects: strategic planning, information services, marketing, sales, and finance. When we merge them all together, or we treat them as one big process, supply chain process, and see them as larger coordinated activities, or coordinate them as one big activity, they would merge with the previous two physical distribution channel, physical supply channel, that merge to become logistics, and that logistics along with all these would merge to become logistics management or supply chain management. Right? Now, what is the importance of strategic planning? Because strategic planning is that aspect because any organization would map its strategy based on all these physical supply and physical distribution channel. That we would see an example later on, because that can be a strategic aspect to gain competitive edge over your competitors, because it ensures the time of delivery, it ensures the location of delivery. Another strategic aspect, it reduces cost. If you focus on the supply chain process, there might be multiple activities which would be adding cost for no reason, and if you take out those activities, if you revamp, if you optimize your supply chain process, that would reduce cost, because this whole process is one of the very significant costs for that. So that strategic planning should be in line with physical distribution and physical supply. Once they are in line, so they also become the part of supply chain process. Then information services, we already discussed the flow of information in both directions. When that is also incorporated into logistics management, that also comes under the umbrella. Then marketing and sales, because flow of information is required to be in both directions, from customer to the firm, and from firm to the customer, from source of raw material to the firm, and from the firm to the source of the raw material, because orders are placed. Those orders are received from the sales representative, and they are required to be sent to the production facility for production of that product. So that would mean, and the customer needs, customer demands, any changes in the product, all that under the marketing and sales perspective would need to be part of supply chain management. right? And then finance, of course, the support division that actually provides the whole financial capital for the processing, that actually processes the payments that are need to be made to your distributors, payments that are need to be made to your suppliers and the suppliers and all that, because finance, the role of finance, the whole business orientation is running on the foundations of finance and for the profit orientation. So in order to manage those relationships, in order to strengthen those relationships, the finance department also needs to be brought on board in supply chain management. Because if your supplier is not made a payment on time, the next time delivery would be delayed, might be delayed. So in order to manage those relationships in an efficient manner, in an effective manner, so that whole supply chain process is doing its job. In fact, the mission of supply chain and logistics management, as we discussed in the last lecture, is delivery of the product at the time it is needed, in the environment it is needed, at the location it is needed, in the least cost manner, and to add customer value, and to ensure profitability and competitive edge of the firm. So if those are the main objectives, then finance, marketing, strategic planning and information services are required to be part of the whole supply chain, which also includes the physical supply and physical distribution channels. So this evolution of supply chain management is, we saw that up till 1960s, it was actually as physical supply, all those scattered activities treated as physical supply and physical distribution channel. But when you add strategy and information services and marketing services and sales and finance services, that became around 2000s, after onwards, it was seen as the whole supply chain management process under the bigger umbrella. So, but the point is that the supply chain, what is to be included in the supply chain might differ from firm to firm, right? Why it would differ? Because it would differ based on the type of the product or the service that is being provided. It might differ based on the organizational structure as well. Why organizational structure? Because departments can be seen as separate entities. Departments can be seen fighting for, departments I mean by functional areas, fighting for one single goal to be achieved for the organization. Now, that organizational structure would again define how supply chain is seen, what activities out of all these are to be included in the supply chain process. And then another important aspect is the management's opinion, how management sees it. Does management see, for example, finance to be included in as part of whole supply chain process, or do they want finance to be managed and looked at separately? As for example, you can say as auditors, or for example as overseers of the whole organizational activity. So it depends on the management's opinion that exactly what activities are to be included in the supply chain process or the logistics process. So if there would be certain organizations who would still be managing physical distribution, physical supply separately. There would be organizations who would be managing these two separately, and then marketing and finance separately, and sales separately, and inventory and information systems separately. So all these, if they are, it depends on the organizational structure, it depends on management's opinion. And then since many firms are producing variety of products, there are multiple types of products, from perishable goods to goods that can be stored. I specifically discussed that time and again. So it depends on the product also, and based on that product, it depends on which activity is very important for the firm. So if it depends on importance of an activity for its whole operations. For example, if a firm is involved in producing cement, the provision of raw material to that cement plant might be very important for that. So it would give more focus to, for example, have stronger relationships with its suppliers as well. So they might treat that as process of supply chain. But in a certain firm which is based on, whose whole strategy is marketing, they might consider that as one of the very important aspects and include that in supply chain, not the distribution as such. For example, maybe Nestle might consider Nestle Milk Pack. In case of Nestle Milk Pack, they might consider that that supply of milk is that is important. I'm not saying that other activities are being ignored, but out of the whole supply chain process, which activity gains more weightage with so much competition, they might focus on marketing. For example, marketing would be the most important aspect of the whole supply chain process. So that activity mix, we would discuss that, because there are primary activities, there are secondary activities. It depends on the product to product, it depends from service to service. Whatever good or service a firm is producing, certain activities might be the primary activities. That their primary activities are those activities which are mostly part of all supply chain processes. Then there would be secondary activities. Certain firms might not need warehousing, for example. A software firm might not need warehousing. For example, a firm with perishable goods might need a specific type of warehousing. Certain types of firms would only process orders once they are received. They would not store them at all. So they would not need, for example, extra material available for them. They would just order the material just in time sort of thing. So the point is that that those secondary activities are defined from product to product. Now, so in the perspective of top management, as we discussed, that what activity is to be included in the whole supply chain process depends on the view of the top management itself. Because in historical perspective of distribution, Peter Drucker, around 1962, it is the supply chain, or it is the last frontier of cost economies. You see, this was the part of the aspect when we saw that from 1960 to 2000, they were looked at as logistics, they were looked at as physical distribution and physical supply chain. All those activities were looked at as physical distribution and physical supply chain. And 2000 onwards, many more activities are part of the whole supply chain process. The smaller box on the right side in that slide, in which we said that all those activities are part of supply chain process, if we expand that box, we would go to that original schematic diagram which we discussed in the start. And we had inter-organizational coordination, we had departmental coordination to give the product and service to the customer, and then for competitive edge. That schematic diagram in the start. So the last box, once expanded, turns into that. That would be another important, in a very, effective and simple way in which you can look at it. So in historical perspective, it was the last frontier of cost economies. But then in the new, this is the view of how top management would think, how vision of top management has changed over time. But in the contemporary view, the new views, distribution is a new frontier for demand generation, a competitive edge. So distribution on one end was seen as the last frontier, right? That this is the end where we are like fighting for success. But then distribution is in the new frontier for demand generation, because now their information is not just going, product is not going forward, there is flow of information backwards also. So once you have that link established, you would have a competitive edge over your competitor. That is why it is the new competitive weapon, because distribution reduces your costs. Distribution cannot be treated as the end of the whole process. It is the beginning of the new process, because that the flow of information from that distribution channel, the forecasting, the demand, the changes in the products are from that end to reverse. So the reverse flow of information is very important in supply chain management process. It is not just the end, it is actually the start. I guess we are almost at the end of our lecture. So let me, I guess there is not very, to summarize the whole lecture again, but I would highlight just a few points. The most important aspects that I discuss is in the start of this slide, where we had a schematic diagram in which the supply chain process was discussed in terms of inter-organizational coordination and intra-organizational or intra-corporation coordination, where the focal firm is managing its relationship with its supplier and its supplier's supplier and customers customers. It needs to manage those relationships along with strong coordination among the inter-department to achieve the competitive edge. Then we discussed a single firm's supply chain process, in which I highlighted that there is flow of information forward and there is a flow of information backward. The product is being distributed from the source of the raw material to the factory, and from the factory to the customer point, and flow of information is very important. We also discussed the reverse logistics, that when warranties are claimed, the product goes back to the factory for repair and maintenance. So we also discussed that physical supply channel and physical distribution channel were seen as separate activities in up till around 2000s, and then they are part, along with other activities like finance, marketing, inventory management, information systems management, strategic planning. Along with all of these, they are part of the whole supply chain process. Then we also highlighted that a single focal firm might not have control on its focal point of its source of its raw material, as well as it might not have that much control on the source of the distribution point where the customers comes in contact with the firm, or where the customer actually receives the product. So that is why supply chain management, the importance of relationships are highlighted a lot. And then in the end, I discussed the activity mix, in which we said that what type of activities are included in the supply chain management depends on the organizational structure, the management's view of what is important for the organization, and as well as how the evolution of supply chain management took place across time, because now management would look at supply chain management as a whole process with combination of smaller activities, but before that it was just physical supply channel and physical distribution channel. And as we saw, and as even in the current slide in 1962, Peter Drucker said that the distribution is the last frontier of scale economies, while currently we see that it is the start of a new process. Actually, it is a new frontier for demand generation and to gain a competitive edge over your customer, over your competitor. So with this, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Take care.